in securing or insecure data storage, especially about sensitive data. Lots of time you think that, oh, you know, I'm just going to store that in shared preferences, maybe somewhere else in another local storage, without thinking that maybe encryption is needed. But there are lots of security attacks that is going to happen and access those data. If it's unencrypted, that means you're giving that to that hacker simply with no effort. All right, securing Flutter apps. Well, this talk is a little bit theoretical with some practical experiences that I will explain about it, and hopefully you will have a good understanding of a standard around mobile application securities. The reason I made this talk is, well, in the last couple of years, me working as a developer, mostly for web, and then switching to mobile, I always had this problem in big companies, especially where you have testers, and they try to like penetrate to the apps, try to hack or different things, and they come up to you and say, hey, you know, you feel you made a very good app and it's secure, but then they come back to you and say, hey, do you know that you actually hard-coded your like security code or like these app keys? And you don't sometimes pay attention as developers because you are very used to developing your app. You're just doing that very regularly. And it's interesting that, as one of the statistics shows, 75% of mobile application in fact fails the basic security penetration tests. That's interesting to listen, to read about. And if you look at the Flutter documentation, there's in fact one page dedicated to security for Flutter, and it comes with 5 pillars, or key pillars in Flutter application. It has 5 steps, from identifying to detecting the security risk, to protecting your application, then how to respond to those attacks and problems, and how to recover in case anything happened to your application. This talk is focusing mostly on the first 3 parts, how you identify, you detect, and possibly protect. The rest, I hope you will go and read more and try to have good solutions for them. So today I'm going to talk about OWASP standard. How many you know OWASP already? Okay, good. So it's not even 20% of this room, which is nice. And we're going to go through the top 10 security risks for mobile application based on OWASP. In fact, we're going to review OWASP MAS, so mobile application security risk. And we talk about some modern approach, RASP. See what is RASP and how it's helping mobile application to protect application security on runtime. We'll figure it out, and there is some interesting things happening over there which you will hear from me soon. My name is Majid. I am based in Oslo, flying from Oslo to here, and head of DevRel at Invertase. In fact, we have a booth over there. You can please come to our booth and say hi and shake hands and maybe win some swag. And I do a lot of stuff for Flutter community in my spare time and at my work. So, like, whatever I do is now also my work for Flutter. It's interesting. It's not that complicated, but interesting. Okay, let's get into OWASP. The project, Open Web Application Security Project, has started a few years ago with the focus on web. But with the emergence of mobile application or mobile development, well, of course, there are now new security, risk for mobile as well. So they recommend always top 10 security risk. So this group are, from time to time, every 2 years, 1 year, depends, they are refining these top 10 security risks. So as you see here, well, it's not only about the title, they actually have a very in-depth details about these security risks. They also come with tools and some checklists that you can always use to protect your application. So the top 10 web, we're not going to talk about it today. However, that doesn't mean it's not valid for mobile application. In fact, almost all of them are valid for mobile as well. We're not going to review it today, however. So keep in mind, later when I share the slides and the links, go through them, at least read them to understand what they are. Because you will figure out that actually it is happening on mobile too. What we are going to review today is the top 10 security risks for mobile. Let's get into it. The first and on top of the list is improper usage of platform, or platform usage, as the title says. So how many of you, tell me, have seen a mobile application that before you install is asking permissions that you don't know what it is, or you may even see in the application later that permission is going to be used? This is one of the example of improper usage of platform. You're asking for permissions that is not needed. There are different, of course, examples that you can think about it when it comes to this security risk. Like, for example, usage of keychain on iOS. So the solution for this problem is always to have these list, policy where usually architect or DevOps or, security people have in mind. Like, don't ask extra, don't do extra unless it's needed. That's the way you should probably think about security in the first one. So I have other things related to Flutter, of course. In order to make sure you're always on top of the security, at least for Flutter, make sure you are updating your application or the SDK frequently. Well, it's not always possible, like especially if major changes comes or breaking changes. Or you have a big application, which even a minor version that has depreciated things will break the app. It's not always possible, but the closer you are to upgrading your app gradually, the better. So as soon as you see an upgrade, if you can upgrade, do it at a time. So this is part of the development. It's hard to convince product managers, especially if you are in a bigger team. You need to talk to product owners, say, hey, now in one day, I need to spend time to just upgrade my SDK and it breaks entire app. They don't really care, but that is important. One of the excuses here that I need to spend that time is security. Well, it might be some security, risk over there in the SDK, which I'm not aware, I need to upgrade. Or maybe you can find it also in changelog. Another thing is dependencies. Lots of us using third-party dependencies in our application. It is impossible to build an application without a dependency. All of us use that. Being in the age of upgrading these dependencies is also important. Make sure dependencies that we are using is also coming from a trusted source. Do not blindly just install something from pub because it does the work that you want. You never know. Check out the code. Make sure that is something that you can trust. It's also nice always to follow up the guidelines from Flutter team. As I said, there is a page that I already put it here on the documentation for security. If you find any bugs or security risk, you can also report to Flutter team directly. There is an email on this page that you can always communicate with the team. Another thing that you can do regarding the permission is using packages or libraries that helps you to ask for permission when it's needed. And one example could be a permission handler. Probably many of you have used that already. Number 2 on the list is insecure data storage. This is especially about encryption and unencrypted data, especially about sensitive data. We're talking about email, passwords, personal information. So lots of time you think that, I'm just going to store that in shared preferences, maybe somewhere else in another local storage, without thinking that maybe encryption is needed. But there are lots of security attacks, that is going to happen and access those data. If it's unencrypted, that means you're giving that to that hacker simply with no effort. So think about storing the data. Even if it's not sensitive, to my opinion, you can always encrypt the data, put it to the storage. There are actually a couple of good solutions on Flutter that you can use. Sorry for my voice. I was talking since morning with people in the booth, and my voice is going slowly, so bear with me. I feel like I'm sounding like a roaster right now, but hopefully it's not like that. 2 packages that I recommend is, one of them probably you have seen before, Flutter Secure Storage, which is built on top of the some standards, and especially the platform standards. And that ensures when you store something to the storage locally, they're secured and encrypted. Another one is a simple database, key value database, is Hive. So it uses, again, a strong encryption algorithm to encrypt your data. And that is happening behind the scenes, so you don't really notice. So it's always good to use these instead of using something that it doesn't do that. One thing that you probably don't really pay attention when you build is when the app goes to background, especially for, let's say, if you do a mobile application for bank or some applications that, showing the sensitive data in the background could be potentially having some risk, let's say. We have a way, at least in Flutter applications, for example, secure application package that helps you to protect your background snapshots, taking background snapshots. Sorry. Insecure communication. This is mostly about data in transit. So when you are communicating with your backend, probably. And this is not really actually a problem for mobile developers. Let's say for us as a Flutter developer, you can't really secure your HTTP like API, which is coming from backend developers, right? But what you can do is you can communicate well with the team. If it's a big team, like a big company, you need to communicate. You can at least raise that as an issue. Say, hey, even though we're using like development environment or maybe even production, which is worse if it's not HTTPS, let's say, when you are communicating, you should communicate that very well. Sending data as a clear text over network, it's always a bad practice. So having a proper SSL or like or TLS certificate, it's recommended. So nowadays, even browsers, let's say, when you go to a browser that is coming with HTTP, it just actually tells you that this site is not secure anymore, right? Chrome does that, Firefox does that. So on mobile, you probably get also some of the issues with some libraries. So communicating that way is always a plus with your team. But there's one way that you can maybe start doing, and that is certificate pinning. There's a package for certificate pinning on POP that you can use to make sure you make a secure tunnel between two clients, or it could be in this case server and backend. I'm not going to go through the details, but the way that it works is just make a secure connection between where you communicate and where the data is. So that is called certificate pinning. Here is an example in my slide. You can take a look at that later. In secure authentication, that's one of the issues that is seen in many mobile applications, especially if you are relying on client-side authentication. So you have an application right now, so user is logged in, you store some data, and you always rely on local data to validate authentication. That is not a good practice on mobile security aspect of it. You should not really rely on only local authentication. Make sure you always communicate back with a trusted server, which is usually your backend, and make sure that is going through a secure data in transit. Well, you get a response back, which is everything is fine. Another thing that you can do is adding more on top of the basic local authentication. Before I go through that, I actually have a video course about authentication and authorization, which I went through the details of authentication and authorization on mobile, particularly in Flutter. So if you're interested to learn more, you can just check out this course later, especially the first 3 videos. Another thing that we can do is adding more on top of the basic of local authentication. For example, adding biometrics, which makes it one layer more secure. And it's not actually hard to do. Sometimes in Flutter, it's just a plugin that you install and just call a function like this one, local auth, and you get everything out of the box. Of course, there are some logic behind it you need to handle, but it's not a big job to do. So considering this is a good practice. We're getting to another interesting topic, cryptography, which me as a developer, I sometimes don't really pay attention, but let me explain about it, and you will figure out why I say I don't even pay attention, and why this is very important. So, first of all, there are different ways or algorithms that you can encrypt data, right? And there are 2 ways to do that, symmetric and asymmetric. Anyone here, can you tell me what's the difference between these 2? Asymmetric encryption or cryptography and asymmetric. That's exactly true. So you all know public key, private key, right? I bet all of you at least use for GitHub, hopefully. So when you do that way, it's an asymmetric way of encrypting data and decrypting back. And when you have a key shared between, as you said, 2 sources, then this is symmetric. Well, different use cases, of course, but it's important to know the differences and when to use which one. And in many cases that we use symmetric, though, let's say, there are some depreciated algorithms that without you probably knowing, you're using some libraries and you're calling some function to get a hash back or a encrypted data back, like for example, MD5 or SHA-1. These are the algorithms that is proved are not secure anymore. They have been reversed engineered, let's say, or reversed back on some computers. It is important to know you know what are the latest and like the greatest way of encrypting your data. So another aspect of this is securing your identity with a proper way of encrypting and decrypting data. I mean, the developer identity. You have different files under your hand when you work with Flutter, right? You have key.jks or like key store properties and, you know, sensitive data. I have seen developers check out these files without encryption to a public repository, which everyone can see. So these are sensitive data, which means you need to take care of the encryption before you're checking out. And even if it's a private repository, still encryption is required. So always make sure that you are encrypting and decrypting your data properly, even though you have a private repository in your company. There are two libraries that gives you the latest algorithm that you can use for these purposes. Encrypt package and crypto package. They both comes with the latest algorithm that you can use for encryption. It's always a good idea, especially when you're storing data on local storage, to store your data encrypted. Authorization. What is authorization? Can someone explain?
You have the right to do something.
Absolutely. Authentication talks about like who is this person, but then authorization tells what this person can do. If you are always relying on your data that is stored in a client side to give permission to people to do something, this is one of the like toughest security risks in mobile application. That sounds a bit strange because it looks like, oh, we should probably do that like out of the box, right? Or maybe backend requests are going to be automatically handled and we get like an error, but that's not always the case. So you should not really assume a person, because of a local data that you stored on a client, has access to something, and you should give that access to that person. A good way of doing that is always communicating with a trusted server or trusted source, which is probably your backend. Client code quality. This is mostly about two things. This is really about third-party applications that you are adding to your Flutter applications, and also talking about ways to make sure you are following same practice. How many of you are working in an enterprise company that maybe 10 developers are working on a code base? And the worst, once one person is quitting, another one is coming. And worse than that, that person is writing the way that he likes or she likes. And then suddenly in a couple of months, you find your code base in a different, completely way. There is no like guideline over there. These are actually sound simple, but brings security risk to your application. So it's always good to have automation tools that is enforcing some guides in your application. You can write a CLI or something with Dart for your application to make sure that is working. You can use Git pre-hooks, let's say, to make sure before someone checking out, it follows a certain criteria. Another thing is always make sure that the static analysis is always happening during a checkout, like maybe before deployment and so on and so forth. One way to do that is using a package named custom lint, which is helping you to write linting on your application, which is based on Dart analysis or Dart analysis plugin, helping you to nag developer if they're not following a certain rules, or even give them a solution for that. And another thing is that the best is to follow, like have a guideline internally in your team, especially based on the effect, like the guidelines, official guidelines from Flutter and Dart team. Code tampering. This is mostly about malicious data that is injected to your application. It comes with different ways of doing that, like having a backdoor, or there are certain cases that, well, you developer or we developer think that, it's good to have a script here if just in case anything happen, I backdoor to my application and do something for the client. That brings a security risk. If you're doing that, you need to do it a proper way. Just creating something to give an access, like a backdoor to your application, it's not always a good practice. And the reason it's not a good practice is because of two different attacks that you get on mobile application or platforms. One is routing. Dominic was talking about it like in a previous talk as well. And jailbreaking, which is accessing to the root of system on iOS. You can definitely prevent at least these attacks with some libraries. If something happens, then you can react to that. One of those plugins is Flutter Jailbreak Detection. Bear with me, there are better ways until the end of the talk. Reverse engineering is always talking about like getting your app and just try to reverse engineer, find a key over there. If it's especially not encrypted, it's easy to get that from a source code. There are tools that it's helping you to do that. Like if you're not familiar with Hopper or IDA Pro, these are the tools that you can just give a binary or like a mobile app binary build, and it just reverse engineer for you. You will see lots of things over there. How can you prevent that? Well, luckily, we as Flutter developers, we don't really need to do much here because Flutter team provides many things out of the box. One of the solutions would be obfuscation, to just make sure the code after we're building is not as clean as someone that can read. Another one is building binary files, which you get that out of the box. You don't really need to think about it in Flutter. And last one is extra functionality in your application. So, have you ever tested a function that requires second authentication, and in the test mode you ignore that, but in production you actually have that? Or similar situation, like in a test mode you're bypassing something, disabling something, but in production you really don't do that. I bet you've done that. These are a bad practice, generally. You're adding some extra functionality that you don't really need, or you have extra functionalities that is just required during development, but you forget to delete during production build. These are the things that bring security risk, for sure, and you need to take care of them. But, luckily, there are new approaches. Some of the things that I mentioned must be taken care during the build time, like statically, but some of them can be detected on a runtime. And that's a new approach which is called RASP, a Runtime Application Self-Protection. It's a way of protecting your application when it's happening during runtime. Let's take a look at that. Well, I mentioned here there are two types of analysis here, right? One is a static and another one is dynamic. So RASP is mostly talking about the dynamic part of analysis on a runtime. RASP is actually focusing on different types of attacks like hooking, routing, or debugger. Actually, debugger is not a secure environment, or emulator or simulator. They're not a secure environment. Fingerprinting and those type of attacks. So RASP is mostly taking care of these type of things. One of the good packages that is helping you out of the box, taking care of everything, is free RASP package. In fact, this is done by Talsec, which you will find them here in the conference around the corner. So they have a booth, and developer of free RASP is actually here. If you want to talk to him, you can go and talk to him. So free RASP is trying to address those issues that I mentioned during runtime that can happen. If you start using free RASP package, you get, well, a couple of different attacks which is notifying you by a callback. For example, on Android, you get routing detected. And in that callback, you can take care of anything you want. What can you do if really like a root attack is happening and you get that callback? Well, I don't know, maybe you can exit the application, you crash, or make your app to crash or something like that, or delete the data immediately. So at least you get some of the attacks on runtime and you can take care of them. So you get both Android and iOS different attacks, and some of the attacks are fairly similar to each other on both platforms, and some of them are slightly different. I have 5 more minutes and my voice is almost gone, so I need to finish before I can't really speak. Security is not just the things that you learn now and you go and get it done. It's always changing, it's progressive, you always need to keep up to date. But how can you do that? Well, there are many different ways that you can learn about it, but knowing the basic, which is the top 10 security risk, at least for mobile, as a developer, to my opinion, is a key. Be on top of that and try to regularly check at least a newsletter for OWASP and make sure that you know what are the most important risks. And last but not least, I didn't get time to talk about it, it's testing. So security, different testing comes for security. It's not really a developer probably job, but you can definitely have a part of testing automated for your application. There are many tools on the website that I will show you shortly that you can go and use and automate some testing like penetration or different type of security testing for your application. And in fact, some of the tools you don't really need to do anything, you just need to run it. As simple as that. This is a source for security securities for mobile application, mass.owasp.org. It comes with white papers and checklists and some tools. I strongly recommend you after this talk to take a look at that, well, either today or later. That's about it. I talked about it like around 35 minutes. I have 5 more minutes, I believe. I don't see the moderator. I can be my moderator myself. If you have any question, happy to answer some of your questions.